So in the month of March, I really, like, as March was happening, I didn't feel like I was reading very much, but I actually read this massive stack of books. So I think what actually happened is that towards the end of March, I was reading two 600-page books side by side. So progress definitely felt very, very slow because it was a long time, like, since I'd finished my last book. But looking back on it, March was actually really successful. I read quite a few books, like more than I normally would in a month, by like big, well-known fantasy authors. And I also started a couple of new fantasy romance series, which I really enjoyed. So while I didn't actually make as big a dent in my TBR as I would like to, I am still very much considering March a success, and I very much want to carry this energy through into April for Realmathon and Magical Readathon. But we will start off with those statistics. So in the month of March, I read a total of 8 books that added up to 3,565 pages and broke down to an average of 115 pages per day. If you guys have noticed, my total page count over the beginning of 2023 has been consistently around like 3,500 pages, which is my old average until I hit that slump where I wasn't reading very much. So it seems like we're back on track, but I don't want to jinx it. For the ratings, we sadly had 1 2-star, but we also had 3 3-stars and 4 4-stars, adding up to a very low average rating for me at 3.37 per book. For the demographics, not very much to report here. All of the books that I read in March were adult books. For the formats, I read 4 standardly formatted novels, I listened to 2 audiobooks, I read 1 ebook and also 1 comic. For the genres, I read 4 fantasy books, 2 fantasy romance, 1 mystery and 1 paranormal. And finally, for the places where I sourced these books from, all 8 of these books came from my own TBR that existed prior to the start of 2023. So as usual, we will be going through these in chronological order, starting off with the first book that I finished in March, which was The Unbroken by C.L. Clarke. And I do have to say, I didn't enjoy this one as much as I expected to. So this one is an adult fantasy story following a soldier called Terrain. It is dual perspective, but the first character we're introduced to is Terrain, who is a soldier who has been taken into the Baladarian army when she was a small child. Now, she was among a group of children that were all taken from these various desert cities and taken to the civilized country of Baladar and raised in the army as one of their own, but not really, because they faced a ton of oppression, prejudice and racism as they were raised in this army. Now, Terrain actually believes in this army ethos. She believes that Baladar are civilizing other cities and she wants to do well for the country and also rise through the ranks. That is until she is stationed in the country that she was taken from as a child and is tasked with quashing a rebellion. And as the plot kind of goes on, Terrain starts to see that maybe Baladar isn't all that she thought it was. Now, our secondary perspective in here is the princess of Baladar called Luca, who is trying to take back her throne from her uncle, who is currently sitting as regent, by proving that she is capable of being the queen. And she's trying to do this by quashing the rebellion. So she kind of enlists Terrain's help to go undercover in the rebellion and find out their secret. She wants to do it, ideally diplomatically, to negotiate a peace between the rebels and the Baladarian forces. So this one started off quite well for me, I feel. I do actually really like the politics in here and the general plot line. It's just the characters and their motivations that I couldn't really get behind. Terrain especially makes the worst decision that she could possibly make at every single turn throughout this book, and not in a way where normally, when I'm reading books following characters that make really bad decisions, normally I can pinpoint where they're making a mistake and the decisions are bad. It just felt like in this that every decision that Terrain made, even though it may have seemed fine on the surface, it had the worst possible outcome that it could have. And that was a theme throughout the course of this. I feel like a lot of this book hinges on a romance between Terrain and Luca that I quite honestly just did not believe. There is nothing about these two, I didn't feel any chemistry between them. I don't understand why they would be romantically interested in each other. It actually seemed like a relationship of convenience, which makes sense kind of while it lasts, but only the first half of the book really establishes Luca and Terrain in each other's company and getting to know each other, because we have a very different tone through the second half of the book. So it didn't make sense to me why this relationship between them would have any kind of lasting impression when it was such an insignificant part of this story to me. I feel like the writing in here is quite, I don't want to say it's cold and it's stark, but it's not written in a way that lends me to empathize with any of the characters. Like, it's not a writing style that elicits any kind of emotion from me and any kind of emotional connection. So my interest in reading this very much hinged, I guess, on the intricacies of the plot. The problem is, though, is that a lot of the characters' decisions and motivations depend on their relationships with various other characters. So if you're not feeling the relationships between the characters, it does just lead to seemingly like a series of stupid decisions, because logically the decisions that they're making aren't making sense. Like, they're not the decision that you would logically take in that situation, but they are making those decisions based on relationships and connections that they have. But as a reader, I didn't feel it, so I didn't believe it. And at every turn, I was just kind of like, why are you doing this? Like, why is this the decision that you have chosen to make? So I am going to be reading the sequel because I am a guest host for the MB Book Club. The live show for the sequel to this, which is the book club book for March, is going to be, I believe, on the 14th of April, and that is for The Faithless by C.L. Clarke, so I will be continuing. I'm not sure. I feel like this is going to be a trilogy, and whether I continue in this series very much depends on how the second book goes, because I just don't feel like, I feel like we have to have something different going on, because I don't feel like we can continue to get like a whole other book out of this series based on romantic feelings that just, to me, they just don't exist. So it doesn't make sense why you keep making decisions kind of like based on these feelings that just felt like they weren't really there. I then moved on to some more high fantasy, and I started the First Law series by Joe Abercrombie with The Blade Itself. This is obviously the series that Catch Up Book Club are currently going to be making our way through until like the middle to late 2024, and it was a very, very good start to the series. I feel I completely agree with what everybody says about this, how it has like very little plot. It's kind of clear that there is a plot, it's just not very much established in this one. This is more establishing like the world, the characters, the politics, and maneuvering people into a place where like a plot is eventually going to happen. So because of that, this one is quite difficult to describe, but we are following three main characters, and we also have prominent side characters in here as well. So the three mains we have are Glocta, who is an inquisitor, which means that he essentially tortures people for the government and like the crown. We also have Jazal, who is a fencing champion. Why do I feel like I've filmed this video before? My TBR. That's why I feel like I've filmed this video before. We also have Jazal, who is a fencing champion, and he's also like the spoiled brat kind of character who comes from like a prestigious family and is within the nobility. And then our final main perspective is Logan, who is a northern barbarian who is in a very different part of the world to Jazal and Glocta like to start off with. I would say that the main plot lines throughout this book are that the magic is disappearing from the world. It seems to have been a lot stronger in the past, and it's one of those situations where none of the general citizens believe in magic anymore because it's been such a long time since they've really seen it, and magic is gradually like continuing to die out throughout this world. And then the other thing that I think is going to be especially prominent is that the Union, which is the main country I guess that we're following, it's the country that Glocta and Jazal are both in, they are gearing up to go to war with the North, and also it seems like there's going to be conflict brewing in the South as well. So essentially this book is just really getting to know the characters. Everyone's kind of moving in different circles, and this book is definitely something that I didn't expect it to be, because I very much thought going into this that we were going to be following this band of unlikely heroes as they embark upon a mission, like they're thrown together to embark upon a mission together, and I thought they were going to be like a band of adventurers from different backgrounds that had to accomplish this task, and we could eventually get to that point, but that's not currently what this is. Like, even though Jazal and Glocta are in the same place, they're moving in very different circles, and for the most part their paths don't really intersect until like the plot thickens, I guess. Something that I really enjoyed about this actually was the humor, and going into it I knew it was going to be funny, and I was actually a little bit worried about that because humor is very hit or miss for me. For example, I don't like the humor in like Second Year and Mistborn. I don't like the humor in Kings of the Wild, and this is actually kind of what I expected from Kings of the Wild in terms of the writing style and the level of humor, and I'm just really happy to say that that was a hit with me, and I did find this funny because it would have been a real like a deal breaker. I would have been extremely irritated by it if it wasn't my kind of humor. The humor as well is very subtle, more I guess erring on the side of like irony and sarcasm than anything like characters aren't walking around generally cracking jokes, I would say. I was also kind of surprised by the setting of this because in my mind going into it, I expected it kind of to be like a more gritty, stark setting, where actually the majority of where we were spending our time was like quite a well-established, like civilized city, and a lot of the events of this book actually rested on the like politics of the world and also like the royal court, even though the characters that we're following didn't really have much to do with that. That does play like a big part in this. And I also really liked the cast of supporting side characters. My favorite character in here is Bayaz, who is the magician. So overall, this was a big success. I gave it 4 stars and I'm very, very excited to continue. I will be reading the sequel in April, ready for our catch-up book club live show in May. And if you have read this and you want more like in-depth spoilery thoughts from me, I did make a book diary for this, which is essentially like a vlog where I talk about my thoughts in spoilery detail as I'm going through the book. I then finished up a book that I potentially started in February. I actually can't remember at this point, but the reason why I picked this one up is because I was saving it from the self-destructing books from 2022. I made the revisit video and realized that this was on it and I didn't want to have to unhaul it unread. So I managed to squeeze it in and I listened to the audiobook for this, which I will say is definitely like a very good route if you're interested in this, because it is a full cast audio, and while it doesn't have like mixed media within the actual book, there are sections of this that are like newspaper articles and like TV news reports, and there's also some like police interviews in here as well. This is the one that I would describe as a mystery. It has a fantastical element, but I would say at its core this is a mystery or thriller novel with the fantasy element just adding something a little bit extra. So this is about a very small town and a group of women who are friends, and they've raised all of their kids together and all of their kids are friends. So one night they're all together while their kids are at a party and they get a call that one of their kids has died at this party. There was a fire and he died, and this is being ruled out as an accident up until one of the kids comes forward and says that the daughter of the town witch is responsible for it, like she killed him with witchcraft. Now this is impossible because there is actually like there is witchcraft in this world, like it is real, the town witch does exist, but magic isn't necessarily hereditary, like it often skips a generation, and it is a well-known fact in this town that this girl doesn't have any magic, so she can't have killed this boy. So what results in this is essentially a witch hunt where because the boy who died is the star quarterback and his parents are like quite rich and influential. So we have a witch hunt where these rich, influential and powerful people start to build this campaign against the town witch, even though they're best friends. They've been best friends for a long time. The witch has used her magic to help a lot of people in this town because that's what she does, but everybody turns against her as this investigation continues. So this story at its core is about mob mentality and witch hunts, and it's about the imbalance of power between the rich and the powerful and the influential and the people who don't have the same resources, and how it is very easy for like smear campaigns to gain traction, and even if they're not true, and even if they're proven to be not true, they still do lasting damage to people who don't have the resources to defend themselves in an appropriate manner that would make all this kind of like go away. I gave this one 3 stars. I really enjoyed it, but I feel like the majority of my enjoyment for this book hinged on the fact that I did listen to the audiobook and I really enjoyed the audio experience. I just love a full cast audio, and I also really like listening to mysteries and thrillers in audio, especially when they are told in first person perspective, as this one is. So I think in terms of the book was definitely a 3-star. The listening experience was probably more of a 4-star for me. This did also have one of the things that I really don't like in a mystery, and that is at the end it did this thing where it's like, and this is what really happened, whereas for me personally, if I get to the end of a book and I don't know what really happened, I can't, you know, like if you have an ambiguous ending or a misleading ending where the book wraps up in a way that isn't necessarily the truth, if you then have to tell me this is what really happened and go through all of the events of the book from a different lens and like show me the truth, then you haven't actually done your job well enough throughout the bulk of the book, because by the time I get to the end I should know what happened. Because you should have, like, the inference should have been there, like I should have been suspicious, but you can't just wrap up a mystery and then like real nicely and everything makes sense and then go, actually this is what really happened, you know? So yeah, it was a 3-star read. Would definitely recommend the audio if you're picking this one up. I'm glad I saved it because it was a pleasant listening experience, but it definitely hasn't changed my life in any way. And then the next 5 books, vlogs for the month. You haven't actually seen me talk about anywhere yet as far as I'm aware, because the vlog that they're all contained in has yet to come. It will be coming very soon. I'm pretty sure it's going to be coming, like it's 100% going to be coming within a week of this wrap up if it hasn't already gone up. But the first book that I read in that vlog was volume 2 of the Angel reboot, which is City of Demons by Brian Edward Hill. So I am currently reading through the Buffy comic reboot series, which is the story of Buffy the Vampire Slayer that's been modernized and brought into, like, I think the first volume set in 2019. So if you're unfamiliar with Buffy, it's a 90s TV show that's my favorite TV show of all time, and it's following a girl who is the one girl in all the world that is tasked with facing the vampires and the forces of evil. She's a 16-year-old girl. She's chosen by destiny. She doesn't have a choice, and she has to fight the hordes of evil. So there is a spin-off show to Buffy called Angel, which follows a vampire with a soul, and that show very much takes a like paranormal investigation kind of structure, as we're following him as he tries to redeem himself and all of the things that he's done in the past before he has a soul by helping the helpless and saving people. So this comic series has brought the 90s, early 2000s TV shows into modern day while keeping the characteristics of the characters and the actors who portrayed them, but putting a little bit of a new spin on it. Now, in terms of the Buffy series, I very much feel like I was catfished by that first volume, as the art style is, I don't like the art style in volumes 2 and 3, and also the storylines are a little bit more out there, whereas I feel like Angel, even though I don't love the art style in here, it is very angular. I feel like the storylines have taken this series in a different place than it goes in the show, but in ways that are believable based on what I know about the characters and the plot. It's also very clear in the Buffy one as well that the creators of this comic series are familiar with Buffy and the lore and like the tiny minute details, because they bring things into the storylines that you only find out at like a later point in the show, or like tiny little details from history are brought through and expanded on a little bit, which I definitely really appreciate. So in terms of the two series, Buffy and Angel, I am enjoying the Angel series a little bit more at the minute. I did give this one 4 stars and I am excited to continue on. I do know that this is the last volume of Angel and it then goes into Angel and Spike, which, I mean, how can I complain about that? Can I say as well, actually, I really appreciated this art. This one in particular, if you've watched Angel, then you know. But yeah, this has kind of renewed my interest in this series, because I have been a little bit disappointed in volumes 2 and 3 of Buffy, and this has made me more excited to continue again. I then picked up my 1-2 star of the month, which sadly was Shadows of Self by Brandon Sanderson. As you guys know, not having the best time with Second Era Mistborn. I did listen to the audio of this one though, which was suggested by Aaron from Books and Busy, but a few other people kind of like doubled down on that and was like, no, like if you're struggling, give the audio a try. And I do have to say that did make this slightly more enjoyable for me. It's a Michael Kramer narration, which in terms of him as a narrator, he doesn't have a narration style that compels me. Like I wouldn't listen to him forever and always and really enjoy my listening experience. But I will say that he is like a very talented narrator, and I did really enjoy the narration of this book. Just really don't like Second Era Mistborn. So if you guys are unfamiliar with Mistborn in general, it is a series by Brandon Sanderson that is going to be split up into 4 eras. The first era is the first trilogy, and that is following a man called Kelsier, who is putting together a team of skilled allomancers to overthrow the final empire and essentially like remove the Dark Lord from power, because 1,000 years prior to the start of the story, there was this ancient war and the Dark One won and has been in power ever since. So allomancers in this world are people who can ingest metals and harness the power of those metals, and that is like the team that Kelsier is putting together is made up of these people who are the best at like their respective powers. So the second era is set 300 years, I think, after book 3, and the reason why Brandon Sanderson wanted to break Mistborn down into eras is that he wanted to show the evolution of a fantasy world and that it's not like stagnant, like it progresses like our world kind of progresses. So this one is a flintlock fantasy. It has like a Western kind of feel to it, and we are following Wax and Wayne. Now Wax is the lord of his household, but 20 years ago he did leave the city to go to the roughs, and he was a lawmaker, which is essentially like a sheriff of the Wild West, albeit like a vigilante style kind of one, and he's had to come back and now take up the head of the household, which he never intended to do, but he is struggling to leave his past life behind. And along with Wayne, who was his sidekick in the roughs, he starts to investigate this string of train robberies that's happening in the city where hostages are being taken taken and a larger plot kind of starts to be uncovered that ties into the mythology of the world, which very much ties into the characters of the first series. Now in this, like with the first one, there are things that I enjoyed, including the links to Cosmeo, because I feel like we've had a little bit of a hint, which I'm very interested in, and also the connections to characters and themes from first era Mistborn, especially in this one, in how some of the characters are being reintroduced into this narrative. I'm definitely really enjoying that. And while this is my least favorite Sanderson series that I've ever read, and I've read most of them, or at least started most of them, it's still Sanderson. So something that I really loved about this one in particular was the plot twist that we got at the end that tied into like the plot of this series specifically, and like Wax and Wayne as characters. Now, what I don't like about this, it's the same in Skyward as well, but I do enjoy Skyward slightly more, although there are things about that series I don't like for different reasons. But the writing style that he has in this has a levity to it that I really don't like. It's the same with J. Kristoff. I feel like there are certain books that both of these authors write that feel like they have very juvenile humor, especially like Wayne in here. He's just giving teenage boy humor and I don't like it. Like Wayne as a character gives me the ick. I think he's a creep. I really don't like him. Some of the things he says, like he just needs to keep his eyes in his head. Like he literally makes me feel sick sometimes. I don't like him at all. Wax is fine. I guess. The Western setting I was always worried about and I don't like it. I also don't like gunfights. I think they're very boring to read and there is a lot of action. This is quite fast-paced in comparison to the majority of Sanderson books I've read, especially in the Cosmere. I don't like fast-paced stories. I think that the gunfights are just really boring, which is sad as well because the action scenes and the fight scenes in first era Mistborn I found to be so cinematic and were some of the best that I've ever read. So I do definitely think that the audiobook was the best route for me to get through this. I'm only continuing to read it because it's part of the Cosmere and I will say that it's worth it for me in that regard because I'm excited about the information that I'm kind of gleaning as I'm going through this. But just in terms of enjoyment, like I really do not like this series and I'm very excited for it to be over. I only have one more to read before I can go back to my reread of the Stormlight and then just one more to finish it off. So yeah, I'm excited to not have to read this anymore, essentially. I then started a new fantasy romance series, which was A Touch of Darkness by Scarlett St. Clair. This is the first of the series is the Hades and Persephone series, and this one is a urban fantasy because it's set in like a fictional version of our world where the gods all came down to earth and like rearranged the continents and now they all just like live among mortals. But there is like a godly realm as well. So Persephone has come to the mortal realm kind of against her mother's wishes, as she does, like her mother's advised against it, and she has done this to study at the university and she's currently doing an internship with a news company called New Athens News. Now Hades in this world runs an exclusive club that's invitation only, and Persephone's best friend gets an invitation and takes Persephone along with her. So she is wandering around this club and she encounters Hades without knowing who he is, and he offers to teach her how to play poker. So while she's learning, she obviously loses a few games, and Hades then, because she's lost, binds her into a bargain where she has to create life in the underworld, and there's like a time limit on this or else she has to live with him forever. But this is something that Persephone can't do because she doesn't actually have the goddess of spring powers that she's supposed to have. Everything that she touches withers and dies. I thought that this book was very absorbent and very addictive and very easy to get into. Like I found it to be immersive, and I feel like one of the reasons for that is that this to me actually read kind of like a novelization of Lore Olympus, especially within the setting. Like I felt like the setting and the tone of this, the atmosphere, was very similar to Lore Olympus, mainly in, when I say atmosphere, I mean like the style of the book and the interpretation of the characters, because Lore Olympus is a lot, like, I want to say sweeter and more wholesome than this is. I liked that it was a fast read. I liked that it was really easy for me to sink into, and I thought that it was very enjoyable. But technically there are things in this that just are not good. The thing that frustrated me the most about this is that there were plot threads that would just kind of appear and dead end into nowhere and kind of be forgotten about in a way, because I noticed stuff like that. Like, you guys know my favorite thing is things like Easter egg hunting. So if you introduce a plot line and then you just never mention it again, like, I'm going to notice. Like, there's a scene where Demeter walks in and she's angry, but then it's never followed up on, like, why was she angry in that moment? We never find out. There's also a scene in particular where Persephone's attending a gala and Hecate provides a mask for her because she's worried that her mother's going to see her. So her mother is present, like her mother enters and Persephone's wearing this mask and Demeter never sees her. But is it because she's wearing a mask? Is it because the mask is magical? Is it because she just generally never crosses paths with Demeter? Because Demeter's never mentioned again aside from in this like red carpet scene where all of the gods enter because it's a gala like for the gods. So yeah, it was frustrating in that regard. And I also feel like it read kind of like fan fiction, not in a bad way, but just in that I feel like going into this, Scarlet St. Clair is expecting you to already know who Hades and Persephone are because there's no kind of like establishing them as characters. I feel like it very much like builds on the fact that we know who Hades and Persephone are and we also know what to expect from them because we're familiar with the myth and also like the reimaginings. And I feel like there was a lot of like character building lacking in that department, almost to the point where like Hades and Persephone are also aware of the fact that they're Hades and Persephone. So when they first meet, there's no like, I guess, tension or curiosity between them. It's more of like an inevitability that something is going to happen between them. And I also felt like that it almost reads like this book was twice the length and it just had things hacked out of it, just the way that things are introduced and then dead end into nothing. And I feel like while I enjoyed the smut, the sex scenes in here were still pretty graphic. So it's not fade to black or anything, but they were definitely abbreviated in length to the point where they felt like they were more secondary sex scenes. You know, like how in a romance you have like your full sex scene that's kind of long and then the rest are more abbreviated. All of the sex scenes in here felt like the abbreviated secondary sex scenes as opposed to like the main event. So very much did enjoy it, but I did find like a lot of faults with it. So this one ended up being a 3-star for me. I then read another high epic fantasy, which was The Great Hunt by Robert Jordan. Can you believe that I read The Great Hunt, Shadows of Self and The Blade itself all in 1 month, along with 3 other books that were like 500 pages? Because I can't. I don't know how this happened. But I'm a co-host for the Wheel of Time read along that was created by Sandra from Got a Thing for Things. I will, if the live show has happened at the time this video is posted, because I don't know when I'm posting it, I will link it for you guys. And I'm also making a spoiler video on this, which should be up on my channel within the next couple of weeks. But this is the second book in the Wheel of Time series, which is obviously one of the most iconic, influential and talked about fantasy series to ever exist. This series is kind of like the first Law series, how I can't really explain what it's about because I don't understand the full scope of the actual plot at this point. But the bare bones of this, I guess, is that in every age, these same events repeat themselves over and over again, but alongside this has been an eternal struggle between light and dark. So in every age, we have the Dragon Reborn, who is this like hero figure that is tasked with fighting back against the Dark One. But it seems like over the last few ages, the Dark One has been gaining traction and the light is losing. So this series is following this age's Dragon Reborn, as well as a group of supporting side characters that are called Tarvaran, which means that they are important to the pattern. Essentially, the theory behind that is that the pattern is time and the Tarvaran disrupt the pattern. So the same events that happen over and over again, the Tarvaran are the ones with the ability to disrupt it, like catalysts. If you know, you know. So yeah, we're following this group of Tarvaran and the Dragon Reborn as they alter this age's pattern. So while that is like the grand scheme, like the overarching plot, I would say that these books in themselves don't necessarily follow that, especially because in this early stage, like we have 16 books in this series, and in this early stage, the characters are actually more focused with outrunning their destiny and not accepting it than they are anything else at this minute. And I will say that one of the frustrating things for me with this series, one of my least favorite things in this book in particular, is that at this point, like I feel like there's potential for it to change, but at this point the characters are being very reactionary. They're waiting for things to happen to them as opposed to going out and interacting with the plot directly. So it's very much they set out on a task to accomplish it, but things happen and they get derailed, and it's just like they're not, I guess, seeking to accomplish anything and accomplishing it. They're just reacting to things happening to them. Something that I really enjoy about this series is the level of detail that Robert Jordan has put into this world. Like, it's very clear that this is a very complex world that is very intricate, and why I particularly like series like this is because there's so much detail in them that it's hard for me to predict which ones are indicators of the plot as a whole, because there's so much, like, it's rich it's realistic in terms of the amount of world building, and I truly appreciate the level of detail that Robert Jordan has put in here. Sadly, I don't love Rand as a character. I find the supporting characters to all be a lot more interesting than him, which is of course frustrating because he is the like dominant perspective that we get. And I feel like my main criticism of this book in particular is one, that I don't feel like it advanced the overall plot as much as I would have liked it to. It was mainly about character development, but I feel like that only really kicked in the last like 100 pages or so of this. But also we didn't get enough of the perspectives that I cared about the most, like Lan and Perrin, and Moraine was just like vastly missing in this installment. But something on the flip side of that, something that I did really like about it is while the perspectives were limited throughout the book and we got like a little bit more at the end, I feel like the female characters in this series really started to shine in this, and I'm definitely excited to see where that like continues throughout the rest of the series, because we had a little bit of a magic school setting in here, and that with the female characters, like the main female characters, was my favorite element of this book. So I gave this one 4 stars. In terms of contents, I enjoyed it more than Eye of the World, but because it didn't progress the plot as much as I expected it to, it ended up kind of on par with Eye of the World, because I expected just like a little bit more in terms of like overall series progression or like pushing any kind of narrative forward. I don't feel like we gained much ground with this installment. And then the final book that I read in the month of April is Blood Mercy by Vila Roth, which has come highly recommended, and I have to say that I did enjoy this quite a lot. This is the first Alpha Ho book club for 2023. We're going to be reading, that's my Patreon fantasy romance book club by the way, we're going to be reading through this entire series, or what's published throughout all of this year, because I think there will be one more book to come that will not yet be released by the time we catch up to what's currently published. But this one is a very political, very slow moving, slow burn fantasy romance featuring a cinnamon roll love interest. So the plot of this one is that we are following the bastard daughter of the king, who is treated terribly by the king. The king treats everyone terribly, but his bastard daughter especially badly, and she is negotiating or meeting with a Hesperine, who is a feared immortal in this world. But essentially she's maneuvered herself to follow the royal court to the palace where these negotiations are taking place, specifically so she can meet a Hesperine. Now the Hesperines have traveled to this summit for the negotiations because they're trying to renegotiate a peace treaty that was established hundreds of years ago but has lapsed over the rule of the like last few kings. So they're trying to reestablish this and gain peace, because the interesting thing about the immortals in this world is that while they are vampiric, they're very different from typical vampiric creatures that we know. Essentially they're the antithesis, because they're very peaceful and also like creatures of good, whereas vampires tend to be like your soulless creatures of darkness. So the interesting thing I would say about the immortals in here is that while this is a romance, the key thing that I feel plays a part in why vampires are so attractive in fantasy and paranormal romance is the element of danger, and this kind of removes that by making these creatures these like good creatures of light. Now the way that they're viewed by the rest of the world is very different to that. They're very misunderstood. They are treated as like creatures of darkness, but in reality they are actually the exact opposite. So the majority of this book is a series of conversations between Leo the immortal and Cassia the king's daughter across a series of nights as this book counts down to the spring equinox, which is perfect that I finished this at the end of March, because the magical readathon round that I'm participating in for April is called Spring Equinox, and I finished this on the last day of the month, so this book counted down to the start of magical readathon, if that makes sense. In terms of my enjoyment of this, it was up and down for a while. The first 80 pages of this I felt were wading through mud. I literally was reading The Great Hunt, like a Wheel of Time book, faster than I was reading this, because I just could not for the life of me get into this. That eased up for me at around the page 125 mark as the characters started to actually interact with each other, like as Cassia and Leo started to actually meet and talk to each other as opposed to being two separate characters that we were following like through the introduction. I did find that the pace slowed down a little bit for me throughout that middle section again, because I then felt like we spent a lot of time in this conversational period between them, like for the middle 300 to 400 pages of the book. But but then I thoroughly enjoyed the end where the pace picked up and the plot kicked in, and I found it very difficult to put down. So overall I gave it 4 stars. I am definitely invested, but this book is definitely a slow burn in terms of your attachment to it, because I feel like it takes a lot to get into, and the more you read, the more into it you get before you kind of like fully realize the level of investment that you've achieved through reading this book. But in terms of the romance and the smut in here, I found in terms of the general sex scenes, there was a little bit too much conversation for my liking and a little bit like too little action. And the writing style of this is actually very formal. I feel like part of the adjustment period of this book is just getting used to the writing style, and I feel like that caused this to read a little bit, just a smidge, like a historical romance because of the formality of the writing, and then of course like the interactions between the characters. That being said, the blood drinking scene in this is one of the sexiest, is definitely the sexiest blood drinking scene I've ever written, but just generally it's one of the sexiest scenes I've ever written. And while I didn't love the actual smut and sex scenes as much as I thought I was going to, the blood drinking scene really did it for me. So I'm very excited, especially based on the end of this, to pick up the second book in this series, which I will for sure be doing before June, so like either in April or May. But based on how I feel at the end of this, which added just like a whole new level of angst and got me even more invested than I was before then, I'm really desperate to pick up the sequel Blood Solace, so hopefully I can read that in April, because it is a thick book, which is why I don't want to read it in April, but it will get me a lot of points for Realmathon and also will fulfill a prompt that I need for my career for Magical Readathon. So those were the 8 books that I read in the month of March. There's only 3 of these that aren't chunky, like the rest of them are like a minimum of 460 pages. I really do feel like I'm back on my bullshit now. Like I'm getting to the point where like every book I read is 500 pages, so I'm getting through like a decent amount of reasonably sized books in a month. And while it didn't feel in the moment like I was reading a lot in March, I am really proud of the amount that I got read in March. So I am truly hoping that we can carry this through to April. But down in the comments, please let me know what your guys' favorite book for March is. Mine was Blood Mercy. I feel it's Blood Mercy or The Blade itself, I feel, were my favorite books, but we're going with Blood Mercy for now. Sadly, we didn't have any 5 stars, but I mean, recently that's actually not that unusual for me. I've still only had 3 5-star reads this year. But yeah, down in the comments let me know what your favorite book of March is. And aside from that, guys, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it, and subscribe if you wanna. If you head into my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, Instagram and Twitter if you'd like to follow me on any of those, as well as a link to my Bookish Candle website, the Etsy for that, and a 10% off discount code. That's it from me today, guys. Bye.
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you'll go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.